do is just to hit the slide share to get my presentation up. Okay, let's see what this does. I'm running two screens here. Let's see, come on. Arrow key. There we go.
Okay.
And it's freezing a little bit, but we're going to charge through this. Before I get started, let me just introduce myself. I'm Kristen Jeffers. I'm born and raised in North Carolina. And what I'm really going to do this evening is I'm going to talk about my story. And I'm going to use my story as a way to sort of illustrate what I talked about in my synopsis. And let's see. Let me try to get my presentation up here. Not letting me. Oh, there it is. This all right. And, all right. So let me put this in the full screen, and we can go ahead and crank up here. All right. So basically, this I'm calling this presentation "Finding Better Words" because a lot of what I do is in words. That's my information below. I'm a little bit more active on Twitter and Instagram than I am on Facebook, but I'm there too. You can go to blackurbanist.com to get a sense of what I've done over the years. The blog is going into its 4th anniversary. And really, what I'm going to talk about this evening, and I'm going to start with my own personal story. Then I'm going to talk about some narratives that I believe that kind of inform my work. And then just thinking about, in general, words that we use and things that we talk about. I'm going to kind of put some word associations up on the screen. And then we'll get back to kind of tying everything together. And then, of course, you can ask questions of me after this. So what brought me into what I do is really my upbringing. I was, my parents and I grew up in a working class area, but I feel like we've had middle class values. My dad wanted to make sure that I never was lost, so he taught me how to read a map, and we used to play around with that. I used to map out things, so I've got a good sort of inner compass. You know, Google Maps is great now, but you know, before those days, I got pretty handy with the map. We used to bike around this community, and the community is it's a mixed income. Was somewhat more mixed income when I was younger, about 25 years ago than it is now. There is public housing involved. There's a strip shopping center that used to be thriving, and now it's full of occupants. But there's definitely not the sense of having everything you need in walking distance. However, you know, if that had been the case at one point, and that was evident. And I also sort of grew up around just buildings, period. My dad was a licensed electrician. My mom's a school teacher. They both met at school. Dad had a lot of pride in the buildings that he helped, you know, wire and build. You know, Dad was also very much well, both parents really. They're very much community people. You know, my mom had taught for, you know, off and on for the last 40 years. You know, there was some time off, but she, for the most part, last 19 or so years, she was consistently in the classroom and at after-school events, and you know, helping out people in the community in that sense. Dad would always, you know, he did his work at the school system. He also would help people, you know, people with electrical problems. A lot of times he would just fix things for far below cost. So, you know, they instilled in me the value of community, the value of seeing people as they were, you know, the value of being able to walk the community, like physically walk, to physically bike, and to physically just, you know, be in the space. And I've always sort of just watched things happen. You know, they widened the road near my house, and I was like, well, why are they widening the road? Why are they cutting down the trees? What are they doing here? So that really sort of stuck with me. But, you know, I never thought this would be anything sort of serious. You know, I never thought this would be a career path for me long after undergrad. Now, in undergrad, I developed a sense of being in a community there. You know, I walked everywhere. You know, all I had to do was just sort of wake up, walk 2 paces to class, walk 2 paces to the dining hall. I was in a special program where I got free and reduced tickets. So it was a sense of being able to just experience community, experience urbanism in that sense. This is long before I knew the terminology. This was about 10 years ago. Once again, I'm sort of in a vernacular sense of knowing what it means to be sort of in a walkable, connected community. And, even though this was a campus community, we were very connected to the Raleigh area. I did my undergrad at NC State University. We were very connected to Raleigh in that sense where, all we had to do was just walk across the street. We weren't gated. We're a public institution. And, we were in walking distance of, major shopping centers. Our student fees, transportation fees, pay into a bus system called the Wolf Line that was free of charge. And that actually, because of the extent of our campus, and if you go to NC State's website, you go to the facilities section, you look at the campus map, you can just see that, that corner of Raleigh is pretty much NC State. So to service that, and to service 30,000 students, thousands more staff and faculty and community members, you had this bus system. So I got pretty used to using the bus system. I used the local bus system on occasion. I took it to the shopping mall. And in Raleigh, those of you familiar with Raleigh definitely does have that sprawl element. It is definitely well deserving of its being the poster child of sprawl. But if you are in sort of the inner Beltline area, there's still a lot of city there. And, there's still a lot of things that have developed just right on the Beltline. If you look up, as far as new urbanist developments, you look up North Hills, that's one example of, one good urbanist thing, and just something that, once again, sort of pushed me back into this notion of community and new urbanism and placemaking, etc. My early career really was what made things solidify. I trained as my undergrad degree is in communication, concentrating in public relations, have a huge interest in media, so I was already looking at doing things in media. I, however, fell into the nonprofit sector as a program coordinator. I did that for a little while, but with nonprofits, funding does different things, and I've had that happen multiple times in my career. And I moved on to a public relations firm that actually was located at the North Hills complex. And there was a day, and I don't know if this happened down your way as well, but there was back in 2008, there was a hurricane right out in the Gulf. And due to the threat of this hurricane coming on the Gulf and the refineries being out of service, a lot of gas stations started upping their prices. I mean, it's upwards of $2–3 an hour in an hour's time, such that my apartment at the time was out by the first job I had. I wanted to be as close as possible to that job. I was literally a 5-minute drive or a 20-minute walk. I never walked it, though, because it didn't feel comfortable, so there was already that element of sort of getting out of the sense of I was in college, of being able to walk everywhere and making myself walk everywhere. And especially by the time I had switched jobs, I'm having to drive 30 minutes in each direction just to make sure I have a livelihood and a roof over my head. And so I thought about getting gas before I left home. I knew that this was going on, that people were talking about shortage of gas. I'm like, yeah, it won't be too much. It might go up 50 cents. It might not even go up at all. This might be just a fluke. However, by the time I drove the 30 minutes home from the North Hills complex to my apartment in South Durham, the usual gas station I went to, I was looking at paying $3.50 in Raleigh and $5 in Durham. So that really sort of stuck with me. Now, there were means to deal with this. The Attorney General sent out a notice about price gouging, so that happened. And so I was like, okay, what's going on here? Why am I so dependent on gas again? I really want to get back to the place where I'm not dependent on this. Now, what brought me to creating the website and the blog, I call it the Graduate School Spark. I had, by this point, this is the fall of 2010, I'm back living in Greensboro where I am now. I decided to get a Master of Public Affairs at USC Greensboro. And I was in my first semester urban politics class. We're talking about all the various elements of urban policy that have affected community building and neighborhood building over the years. And so I'm listening to this. I'm reading this. I'm also reading some of these sort of quote-unquote industry blogs, the streets blogs, Greater Washington's, Metro Jacksonville's of the era, and not really seeing anybody that looked like me. Now, granted, there was a few of those sites did have some African American contributors. I didn't see a lot of women, being a double minority. I was like, okay, I'm just not hearing myself. And having been trained as a communications sort of scholar, having been trained in the sense of community, I thought, okay, let me step out here and do this. I'd already had a blog, sort of a semi-professional blog. It was under a different name. I blogged on a lot more issues. Neighborhoods and Communities at SmartGroup was just one of them. And I had been able to go visit some, conferences, start getting to know people. And at that point, that's sort of when the Black Urbanist started. And what really sort of brought it to everyone's attention was that I took the time to think about a name that would draw attention, a name that would capture who I am. And I always tell people that it is stating the obvious. I'm very interested in the urban environment. I've always lived within the city limits, even though, of course, being Southern, that may or may not look like what cities look like up north, but it's still, we are incorporated into a municipal structure. We pay municipal taxes. We have things that municipalities provide for people because you are annexed into a city. So I was just used to that environment. And so later on, I started working on Twitter as at Black Urbanist. I started, just tweeting different things. I had an editor from Grist contact me, ended up writing a story called Why is Urbanism Black and White? And asking that question, I just wanted to kind of see who was there, at least in the professional space, asking this question. And so really, my story kind of dovetails, and my interest in words and how we talk about the urban planning and urban planning, the root of that is just a concern for people and communities left behind. My parents ended up divorcing, so we no longer lived in that house where, I was walking and biking from, where because we were adjacent to public housing, there was no delivery service, and not understanding why Pizza Hut couldn't deliver to our house. We had the money, why couldn't they just show up? And, of course, later on down the line, last year, tragically losing my father as a result of the fact that the neighborhood dynamics were changing. But even before I lost my father, that he passed away, he had lost his vehicle thanks to an accident. He had retired from the school system, but, financial challenges have happened. Once again, we're talking in the 2008 range here with my dad, starting to have some financial challenges, starting to not have as much work with residential construction. He had already retired. And he, once again, as I mentioned before, a very generous person, so he's going to do everything he can to make sure everybody else is good, even at the expense of himself. So, watching him after this wreck, walking places, we're talking about him walking down 4-lane roads, we're talking about him walking down U.S. highways, we're talking about him walking 10 miles a day all the way across town. My father walked from one county to another. And granted, we're only talking 15, 20 miles, but he still walked down a U.S. highway to go visit someone just because he would not. We do have bus service, but we're talking hour headways. We're nowhere near putting in like intercity rail or intracity rail. We do have Amtrak service. We spent millions of dollars to restore Amtrak station, and it's a great pillar of the Greensboro community. Our buses that also come through this depot. The infrastructure is there, but the practicality of my father being of lower income all of a sudden, being of need, and just saying because of him being of the old school, and both of my parents were raised in farm situations, they both moved. Well, my dad's neighborhood was annexed into Greensboro at one point. My mom was a little bit further out, so that's still completely rural, but just that sense of rural values, having been in the field and having a sense of doing whatever it takes to work. So that, between my own parents and between people, our neighbors, people from our churches, various churches we've attended over the years, and just a concern for, from my own faith background and just my concern for people, that's kind of driven a lot of this project and getting the word out. And this is another sort of piece of my belief system. This is another narrative I created, getting back into those narratives that I mentioned. I believe that all money is green, no matter what color hands hold or use it. Watching the retail environment just change in the neighborhoods I live in. Even the neighborhood that we live in now, we're losing an anchor store at our shopping mall. We are, some of the shopping areas, these were state-of-the-art big box centers that are now reduced and moved somewhere else, and so they're partially full. Seeing a Borders be replaced with a Walmart versus going somewhere else where the Borders was replaced with another Barnes and Noble or some other big box store that has a slightly different demographic, versus we getting in our neighborhoods something that just doesn't line up to me. Once again, just the whole concept of the new Jim Crow, of different people getting different sentences for different crimes, the fact that crime does have a stronghold. Thankfully, outside of my dad, what's happened with my dad, and outside of me having been robbed at gunpoint when I was living in that area of Durham, and that was actually quote-unquote a luxury area. If you are familiar with the Raleigh-Durham area, near the Research Triangle Park area, a lot of homes have been built to service people who work for, say, IBM or some of the other research and development operations. So I was in an area that was relatively, stable. Yet, they wanted me the night that happened. Thankfully, I didn't lose. Obviously, didn't lose my life. Didn't lose any property. They took my purse out of my car, and I screamed, and they ran, and they threw everything down. But to not have, they wanted me to identify this person. They wanted to put him on the lineup, and I just couldn't. I'm like, I don't know who this person is. I could ruin a life. And even fast forward, you all are very familiar in your area of you guys are sort of a national avatar now for what can happen when people define certain people a certain way, define the streets in a certain way, and define your neighbors in a certain way. And just how the justice system works as far as certain people getting off on certain things and certain other people not. Another issue is coming up with the legalization of marijuana in certain states. It hasn't changed. A lot of people that sold marijuana years ago are going to still be in jail in some respects because, the rules are different. Just what we have going on in not just the justice system, but, governmental, fiscal environments, cities going bankrupt, cities running out of tax bases, all the school issues, whether or not, we should go completely voucher charter versus put more money into public schools, what are they teaching, all the pedagogies that go through, and the effect that has on our kids, kids being sort of resegregated in some neighborhoods, kids not being resegregated. And just that sort of a thing that I'm thinking about, like I said, I grew up in schools, my mom taught school, what are we doing with the kids? Well, are we teaching them to be good citizens? Are we preparing them for what's next? And then finally, just when we talk about bus systems, and train systems and just public transit in general, I feel like there's a time and place for all modes. Yes, people also sort of demonize you on the other end if your car's not a Prius, but you do what you have to do, especially when we're talking about marginalized communities or we're talking about communities of color, communities that, may see having a car as the pinnacle and not as, something that you just casually get rid of because it's the cool thing to do and you want to be green, and so not having a car is green. You think about all the people who all they have is the bus, and the bus comes every other hour, and they just feel out of the loop. And of course, that's a practical consideration that it may take 2 or 3 hours for you to get to work, and you may not get home, you may have to have a cab. All these things, all these elements that come in encompass the transit system and people's thoughts around that. And then, just period. I feel like in the African American and the Latino community, what people may talk about just, a recession, a last global recession, but for a lot of people, when mills have shut down, when, retail stores have moved away, when bus stops get moved, that's just a minor economic change, and that's, affects, what's going on. Loss of homes because there's no jobs or you can't get the jobs anymore, and just a greater sense of who's getting money and where money's coming from. And so that's really, those are the things that sort of inform what I talk about. Now, I do subscribe to the New Urbanist movement. I do subscribe to the placemaking movement. pretty much any buzzword along with that we may all know and subscribe to, I do as well, but this is my lens that I bring from it, and this is how I approach what I'm doing. So how do we talk about this? What I do is I tell stories, as I've been doing for the last, about 20 minutes or so. I've just told my story. And, what do these stories mean? And, I'm just going to kind of flash a few words across the screen. You can just sort of think about it, have in the back of your head. If you want to, when we go to question and answer, if you want to ask these questions back to me, feel free to. I'm not going to just elaborate on them, but I am going to just flash through these for a few seconds. So, this one, if I hadn't been addressing you guys in Florida, I probably wouldn't start with this one, but this definitely is a touch point for your community and communities really across America, but especially here. What is the hood? I apologize for my Spanish is a little off. I did take it, I do understand it, but just, being able to ask this question properly and knowing when to ask that question and for people to make that association. What's this association? What does this mean? What makes a neighborhood nice versus not nice? Is it violence? Is it the size of the house? What are we dealing with here? Then we get into the technical terms, the industry terms, the things that people use in academic situations. Sometimes they use them in the industry itself, the architecture, engineering, construction industry itself, policy, etc. Same with this one. This one, that one. And then I like to call this one the G word. And, people have different definitions, and like I said, you can always ask me any questions, but I definitely want you to think about this question and think about it if you're working in a community, what that really means. Same with this, because for a lot of people, this one and that one are practically the same. And that's unfortunate because there are differences. There's sets of policy along those, but that there is a difference there. Then just getting into land types. I do mean, what is the rural setting? What does that mean to you? What constitutes rural areas, the country in that sense? Not, what is the United States, or what is a state in that, sense. Suburbia. Where does it end? Where does it start? Is it inner? Is it outer? Is it exurban, interurban, whatever? What is the city? Because I know I wasn't going to kind of quantify some of this, but if you look into the dictionary, a city and a town can almost be defined the same. So when does it become a town? When does it become a city? Now, to talk about why examining word usage, there are at least two major reasons why I decided to go with word analysis and why I've stayed in the communication realm, along with building in extra knowledge from planning and placemaking and reading people who do the drawing and do the development. First and foremost, it's the media. When I go on, you go on the regular media, and a lot of times people use things like suburb and city and town as shorthand. I've heard some of the colloquialisms of the hood. Obviously, Stand Your Ground's been all over the media. It got all over. The media was really a big piece of people knowing that this was going on. And then just, in the print media, even in sort of the placemaking, in the sort of the professional media, the trade media, as it were, how do people talk about what they're doing in that sense? And then another piece of why I think that talking about the words that we use and, focusing on the blog and using social media, using a form of media, is that people always talk. They share their stories. The oral tradition is huge. Not to say that that's part of every African American and Latino's culture, but for a lot of people, especially people who have Southern roots, people who can definitely trace their lineage back to rural time, back to a certain space where this was happening. This is valid. And even now, and this is my honest opinion, when I look at sites that are targeted towards African Americans and Latinos, I see a lot of emphasis on gossip and just, sort of storytelling on the light end, as far as like, digging in on an academic level, putting down research, I don't necessarily see those things happening. Now, I try to do that to help, my audience. I know I have an academic and I have a community audience, and I want to be that space in the middle. And so just to kind of sync this back together and, get a little slang in here, taking back the streets. I am, first and foremost, and this may sound self-helpy, this may sound like not even relevant to the conversation, but it's about definitely self-love and self-care. If you don't feel like you like where you live, then you can't really tell the story of where somebody else should live, or, and other people can't do that. People who have the self-esteem, self-care, just being able to help them, empower them to be able to tell their stories. Like I said, you're then able to empower people to tell stories, and then when you empower people to tell stories, you can tell them to the right people. And the right people meaning, government officials, in some cases developers who may be friendly to listen, and then you get things sort of integrated. So that's the end of my presentation, and at this point, let me get this so I can see you guys and take some questions.
So we got a few minutes for questions. Anyone have while she's getting the screen, anyone have any questions they want to pose to Kristen? You heard the question.
Yeah. Kristen, are you familiar with Orlando?
Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay, and hopefully I can swap the screen back so you guys can see me too.
The question was, are you familiar with Orlando?
I have, like anybody else, I've obviously done the Disney World trip. It was sort of a brief trip. The first time I came to Orlando was at a bowl game. My family, one of the things my mom's side we do, we travel a lot, and so we came down to Orlando for a bowl game. So a bowl game at the Orange Bowl, not the actual Orange Bowl, but one of the baby bowls. And so I have seen how spread out you guys are. I've actually flown into Orlando's airport because I did take a cruise off of Canaveral. So I've been to the airport. I've been to sort of downtown. I noticed there were some nice lake elements there. I've obviously been there, seen it since Sunrail has gone online. I don't know the effect of that, but that's sort of my familiarity. In my mind, it wasn't that much different than being in the Raleigh area, the Greensboro area, besides the fact that, it was a little bit more tropical, the tree lines, and it just seemed like you guys are a little bit more spread out. So that's my familiarity.
No, I just asked that because your description of where you lived at before, it sounded similar to maybe like an Ocoee, right, in our area, maybe Pine Hills. So I was just trying to get a good feel for where you were describing in Raleigh.
Yeah, what I was definitely talking about North Carolina. That this is definitely Greensboro, North Carolina, is central. Between Raleigh and Charlotte. I did my undergrad in Raleigh, and I lived in Durham. So that's the sense. And granted, we're both sort of in southern states, so you may see similarities, and that's kind of the goal of my work. I hope that people can see similarities. So.
Kristen, you mentioned gentrification and urban renewal and the difference between them. I can certainly think of a couple of things, but what did you mean by that?
I definitely meant that, I saw a presentation by a developer who talked about, when we gentrify, we're building up community. This was in Charleston. They were touting how their development was actually raising all the tides, and, they were making provisions for having multiple levels of housing. But the thing is with urban renewal in some ways as a policy sort of predates the conversation around gentrification and what we use the term gentrification for now. Urban renewal was, federal policy of cities getting the funds between, the highway funds or any other funds to redevelop. And of course, what was left behind a lot of times were empty lots, were places that just have been languishing, sitting there. Now with gentrification, you can have that on a block-by-block basis. The government's not necessarily involved in gentrification. A lot of times the market can be involved in gentrification. And depending on the context, gentrification can lift people. But I am seeing where the two can be merged. The two can have the same effect of leaving people out, leaving people in the dust. And, we're still sort of sorting through that question because there's still obviously people left behind of all demographics and all races. But, to me, urban renewal is that the federal policy of the 50s and 60s. Gentrification is what's happening now, which may or may not be similar.
I think I got time for one more question. Okay, I'll ask the last question. I think one of the things that attracted the most attention for you is the intersection of Black and urbanism. I think a lot of the dialogue around modern urbanism and African Americans is one of failure, and your writings and talks around the sort of Black urbanist creates a space for African Americans to be included. And your emphasis on story clearly dovetails a lot with some of the other narratives we've had around trying to improve the community. Do you think that this effort is going to spread? Because I think arguably some of the things that you talked about that influenced you and sort of like sparked you on your journey can be applied to lots of minority neighborhoods or low-income neighborhoods for that matter, and are often lost in the dialogue around urban development, or they're not as easily captured in that process. So do you see a broader public sort of latching on, or are you in a bit of a niche in terms of the dialogue and the stories that you're bringing? Are you talking to an audience that's receptive, or are you finding resistance?
It depends. I was looking up, there's very popular, on Blocker, there's not even a section for urban planning. So there's a demographic of just all women where you don't have a place where you can just talk about urban planning. Yet urban planning issues, local government, it affects everybody. And so, right now I don't necessarily have the grab of, it being all politics or all green or all, development building. But I'm definitely seeing where people are bringing me into conversations. I'm definitely having, roundtable conversations. And, usually it starts out like, if you're talking about people who want to ride trains and, you stay in that niche. Or you have people who are like, why are the malls closing? So I talk about that. I have people who we might talk about just where we used to be, with that whole I'm so whatever meme that went through the internet. That was a major sense of people talking about, where they grew up, places in general, places where they may have had their, first date, or places where they got married, that sense of, popularity and popular conversation. In a way, a lot of this was dinner table conversation, especially with my mom and her siblings, we would just talk about just sort of current events, and, especially with the economy crashing, we would often talk about, homes being bought, in a way, we've sort of been a little bit humble with, our surroundings, we've lived a little lean, and that's allowed us to be able to do things like travel and save up for rainy days. And so we talk a lot about policy. We talk a lot about, just what's going on in the world. And a lot of that does dovetail into issues of planning, issues of who's in space, who's allowed in space. And I definitely see this building. Eventually, somebody's going to see the need for realizing that it's not just voting every 4 years for the president that changes your community. It's knowing how to go to the planning commission, knowing how to go to the zoning commission, and knowing how to express yourself and say, look, this house in the corner is important to us. We have this change.org petition. And just reaching into those communities. I haven't had a chance to really dig into and work with churches and other houses of faith yet. I definitely see them seeing a commonality, and then just other community organizations. So it's just a matter of me, like I said, I do stay in the academic plane a lot, but I'm working on finding ways to make this a dinner table conversation and spending more time with this project so that it does become a wider network. And I was just talking with someone where we're going to work together to do that. So just in the coming weeks, you can follow me on my various networks, social networks. I have an email list, and just see what we're able to do. And like I said, anybody who's listening tonight virtually, I can come and have this conversation. So that's where I see things happen.
All right, well, thanks for taking the time to give Kristen a round of applause. Thanks for sharing your work and your journey. I really appreciate it. Rethinking the City is a lot about trying to understand how change makers in different places are sort of inspired and engaged. So you really gave us a lot to think about, and I think your work does dovetail very nicely with some of the questions we have about neighborhoods and perceptions, and even transit, which is something that's really part of our dialogue here. So thanks for taking the time, and good luck with your project.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and you guys have a great evening.
See you later.